For my final major project, I wanted to make an interactive gameplay experience where a wide range of players could experiment with different musical combinations and melodies, creating a compositional tool for a wider audience. I wanted to make a gameplay experience that both music makers and game players could enjoy and use. So, how can gameplay mechanics and adaptive music systems be combined to create an intuitive and engaging compositional experience for players without musical training? In order to figure out my next steps, I looked into how others have used sound in interactive ways and the way musical systems have been adapted in other video games. I needed to see the way in which sound is manipulated to come up with my own interpretation and achieve my aims. Relevant contextual practice. Electroplankton. Electroplankton is a sound creation-based video game released in 2005 in Japan and then re-released in 2006 for Europe and North America. It was made as a music creation tool that showcased what the Nintendo DS hardware was capable of. This game was actually considered to be more of a toy than a game, as there was no progression or reward system, no goal set to win or lose. In 2008, it won the Guinness World Records Gamers Edition as the first game to be a compositional tool. Even as a compositional tool, Electroplankton is easy to navigate, with very clear visual interactions to engage a wider audience. Most control is done by the stylus, allowing players to activate and change different musical notes, rhythms, and sounds. Some of the levels within it are very basic, but others allow the player to create more complex combinations. This is key to take inspiration from, as Electroplankton's ability to be easily navigated gives it more versatility for a wider audience. It's important to take on board for my own work, as it can help me to establish my goals of creating an engaging experience for people without people needing musical training to use it. Boinkiss. Taking the idea of manipulating sound using a tool, Andy Dolphin's collection of sound tools known as Dizdar uses this idea. One of his examples that I'm going to briefly focus on is the one called Boinkiss. Dolphin shows himself drawing different coloured lines before spawning in coloured balls that then bounce off of those lines to create different sounds in random arrangements. Both Electroplankton and Boinkiss give very good insight into ways music can be adapted intentionally by a player. They are both very controlled environments for the player and the sound output they wish to create. Taking this into account, I knew I needed to make the music very obviously interchangeable, making choices very intentional for the player, as without this, the compositional aspect of the game could be lost, and the game would be much less creative and free for choice. However, whilst both of these examples are heavily interactive, they may lack the progression and rewards some gamers will want to keep engaged. Game preferences are wider, and if I wish to reach a wider audience, I need to appeal to the more progression-based player in addition to the creative-based and music-making players. Without this, it could be seen as more of a tool and less of a game. Skyrim. While Skyrim is a bad example of more vertical adapted music and the player controlling the sound intentionally, its ability to blend and change depending on the environment the player puts themselves in is hugely effective. Jeremy Soul's music effortlessly blends as the player explores, changing when entering different areas or in and out of battle.
I made my fortune as a sea captain, but now I'm retired.
These pieces of music are horizontal, but are still very adaptive.
I'll water the ground with your blood.
Taking this into account, when making my game, it may be effective to create horizontal music sections that the player can layer on top of each other, allowing them to create different variations. Guardians of the Galaxy. To make the music more vertically orchestrated, I could also investigate creating different moods or intensities, like in this clip from the Guardians of the Galaxy game, where the music changes depending on whether the player decides to equip or unequip Peter's mask.
Perhaps the Nova Killer knows how to redirect these machines. She has experience.
Maybe I can get up higher to see what's going on. Groot, I think I have an idea.
When the player equips the mask, the music playing changes from an orchestral piece of music into a synth rendition, directly altering the music depending on the player's decisions. Whilst in both of these video games, the player's goal isn't to change the music, I can take inspiration from its situational changes and attempt to combine that with the creativity and free choice used in Electroplankton and Boinkus. Development, experimentation and system demonstrations. Early ideas, designs, technical frameworks, problems encountered and changes made, as well as the player's journey, navigation and compositional manipulation within the game space. In order to keep interest for players while allowing them to express creativity and adaptivity, I have established I will need a progression and reward system, a goal to keep engagement for the wider audience. This is because a purely compositional tool may not be as interesting or engaging for the average player or person. In order to make a system like this, I decided to create fetch quest gameplay for each sound I implemented into the game. Players would need to seek out the sounds by listening for them, creating an audio exploration experience. Once each sound was located, it would then be unlocked and usable. This is a good way of keeping interest for the player, as it engages them to progress and unlock different sounds as time goes on, unlocking more of the game and in turn unlocking more creative and compositional options. It gives the player that reward system, with a very open world aspect, as they get to decide how often they progress to unlock more sounds. To do this, I found some assets in the asset store that appeared as magical glowing circles. I then categorised my music into melodic layers, homophonic layers and drones, and bass lines and riffs. I wanted each of the three categories to have different colours associated with them, where the player walks into the corresponding coloured circle when the sound is found, activating the sound in the compositional area and deactivating it from the search area. I also wanted there to be a sound cue when the sound is located, adding to the reward system, letting players know they've successfully unlocked the sound, and further building the engagement to find each one. I added in a music system where the most basic version of each melody would play louder when the player approached the sound, but where the sound would then reduce as the player created more distance. I did this using sound-based parameter triggers, connecting FMOD's parameters to an on-off system for each sound. Moving forward from this, I used these same parameters to create an on-off system within the compositional game space. In order to refer back to my main goal of creating an intuitive experience without needing musical training to navigate, I had to create something relatively simple to understand. My first step was making this on-off system. Keeping it connected to the searching stage, I kept with the idea of the player walking into different coloured circles to control the game space. I matched the same type of circle to the search stage, but colour-coded them red and green for on and off. To make each sound state of being on and off more visible, I also added red and green spheres that sat above the ground, making them easier to see from a distance for the player. This was to give the player an easy-to-understand system. Turning sounds on and off by standing with easy visible cues takes away the complications that people without musical training may be less familiar with. To expand on my goal of creating an intuitive and engaging compositional experience, I needed a larger variation than just turning sounds on and off to give depth. In my FMOD system, I decided to add some deeper layers to some of the sounds, deciding to connect them to intensity changes. This would mean players could decide how deeply textural they wanted specific sounds, instead of only texturally focusing on the music as a whole when sounds played collectively. In order to keep the system easy to navigate, for the sounds that I had added intensity differences, when the sound was turned on, coloured number options would appear. When the player would stand on a red circle, it would switch to that intensity. For example, if the player turned the sound on and the intensity was at 1, with the number 1 circle appearing as green, and they decided to stand on the red number 3, number 1 would turn red and turn off, and number 3 would turn green and start playing. Expanding the work and what I could do with it. Changes and improvements I can make and have made, and the next steps for my project. From here, I realised there were a lot of other techniques and compositional changes I could add for the player. 1. I could change the volume using the on-off parameters. Since they changed the volume from 0 to 1, and my item search system used decimal volume increases and decreases, I could utilise this, creating a similar system to the intensity changes, but instead it altered the on-off parameter rather than the intensity parameters. In short, this would allow the player to make the sections they want as more of an accompaniment quieter, and anything they want as the main melody or more noticeable sound of their choosing could be louder and more noticeable, creating more textural compositional abilities. 2. I could add further randomization. Instead of adding mostly linear melodic changes, I could add a higher or lower chance of certain sounds playing when the intensity is changed, giving the music more of a randomized feel. This could create more of a one-of-a-kind piece of music for the player, making it more their own piece of compositional music rather than a rated arrangement that is alluded to be composed but is partially pre-written. On the other hand, melodically, this did not work in practice as it gave the music less control. Whilst that sounds ideal for an engaging and intuitive compositional experience, it created clashing, a lack of balance in the music and lots of clutter, rather than keeping the player engaged with layering the music and changing the intensities to create new musical arrangements. Although, subtle occasional randomised extra beats did work with the drums. I did not randomise too much, however, so it worked without overcrowding the music. Overall, it was the right decision in this case to avoid it with the melodic sounds, but the occasional drum beats didn't hurt. 3. I could add BPM and key change switches. I could create different versions of the existing musical melodies, allowing the music to change keys and rhythms. I would do this by creating the same system again in FMOD as the original, but with these key changes or tempo changes in new transition sections of music within middleware. This could also be used to make swing rhythms, or perhaps sadder or more ballad-like versions of melodies in the slower BPM, with more active and expressive versions in the higher BPMs. Unfortunately, this would not create enough stronger variation, as the whole music system would be changed the same way, but it could give the player more creative freedom and as a result engagement in the game space, as it would create a whole new angle on how the music is played and sounds. On another note, I could also add a mute option that mutes the entire musical system, rather than the player having to manually turn off the entire system one by one. I realised this could be important as some people's brains work better when they take a break from sound, while others are more creative and explorative with sound actively going on. Giving a player the option to mute the entire system allows them to make that decision for themselves to silence everything if they need it. I decided this was important enough to add sooner than any other musical changes and adaptive ideas. However, in order for my search quest to still work, the music would need to be on in some aspect to hear the sounds the player needed to find. I tried to figure out a way of muting just the music I had found, but since I decided to make my music system in one timeline for more simplicity within my FMOD project, I had limited options. I could 1. Reshape my music system to have individual systems for every piece of music alongside the overall compositional track, and as a result have to recode all of the objects I needed to find. I could 2. Create a reset system, where when stepping out of the designated area, the music would reset, and all sounds that had been found would turn off, but the main sound, the master, would not mute and would allow the player to still hear the sounds they needed to find. I decided that whilst both options would require some work, the second option would require less and would not overload the music system, nor would it mean I would have to recode my fetch quest system. In order to make the reset system work in a way that did not interrupt the fetch quest and create a trigger system that would only reset discovered sounds, I created new triggers for each sound that would only become available to walk through after each sound was found. The only issue other than the added workload I discovered from this was that there was no linear path for the player to find each sound, and as a result the reset box would always be there even after completing the fetch quest. What I figured I could add in the future was a trigger that would move up by 1 every time a sound was found, with each and every find trigger having the command to do this, and so once all sounds are found, the trigger would move up enough to touch the player and deactivate the reset system to be an optional circle to walk in rather than a mandatory option when leaving the area. Therefore meaning the player could explore the map whilst listening to their music, engaging them into the game space further. It could also then act as a reward for completion, adding to the progression and reward system. This was less important than finishing the music system, however, so I worked on that first and figured it would be a good way to open up this ending goal system for the player later on. One of the final things I added to my process was ambience. Since my game is mostly focused on creative aspects, it did not need a huge focus around ambience separated from the music itself. However, to keep with the video game engagement, I needed some ambient sound design to match with the scene my game was set in. I added in some grass footsteps that I had recorded that randomised from a multi-track system, deciding quiet footsteps was best. I did not want to overload the player with too much conflicting sound. I then decided some subtle bird sound that I recorded would be fitting. I made this using scatterers in FMOD to create a pure randomised system of birdsong. To keep it from conflicting with the music too much, I decided to add an on-off switch for the birdsong, so if the player did not like it during the compositional process, they could turn it off if they wanted to. Evaluations. successes, limitations, and future development plans. So, how can gameplay mechanics and adaptive music systems be combined to create an intuitive and engaging compositional experience for players without needing musical training? In answer to this, I believe I have for the most part created an adaptive and compositional music experience within a game space that does not require musical training to understand. I also believe I have created an engaging progression system, rewarding the player with more creative freedom as they seek out each sound to unlock and therefore giving them a reason to progress. I also believe both the progression and reward system and the compositional experiences have been linked effectively due to the need for gameplay to allow the player to experiment and compose. This is for the most part, however, as during this process I've asked myself an important question. How much of this game is composition for the player versus composition for me? The game itself is made up of lots of melodies and sounds that the player has had no part in. Using this, you can argue the music is more navigated and arranged versus being composed. On the other hand, I as the creator have not decided the order, intensity, or any other changes, as those decisions are made by the player. Variation, texture, and creativity is decided by the player and not by me. I believe there is shared ownership in this compositional process. The music is not written from scratch by the player, but it is laid out how they wish. This could be linked back to the way in which players decide to activate sounds in electroplankton. The player does not actually decide the sound, or know how it is going to play until they are using it, but they have control of how it's used. This could also be linked to the way the player controls the music changes in Guardians of the Galaxy. They don't make the decision to put on or remove Peter's mask for musical purposes, but their gameplay decisions directly affect the sound they hear and the way it plays. Overall, I think this confirms that whilst the player is not writing the music themselves from scratch, the way they change it, use it, and arrange it makes it a compositional experience. One crucial issue I did come across was during the fetch quest section. Since I decided to put all of my music system in one timeline, this, as mentioned, made creating my reset system difficult. It also restricted my abilities in the listening phase when searching for sounds. While the seek distance was spot on when transitioning sounds on and off and in between intensities in the compositional space, it meant that it could not be a different speed for the searching phase. This was all because I had used the same timeline of music, rather than new timelines for each sound separate from the main compositional timeline. This meant that in the searching phase, sounds sometimes took longer than ideal to hear, and I was not able to implement spatialization on them at all without affecting the compositional phase. To combat this, I moved the triggers for the volume increases to be closer to the objects, therefore giving a subtle but more accurate build of the sound when approaching the objects. I also decided to slightly speed up the seek distance where it would not overly affect the compositional experience, but positively affected the fetch quest experience. This did not fix the spatialization issue, however, so specific direction could be slightly misconstrued in gameplay. Therefore, in the future I would change my musical system. I would create separate timelines for each musical phrase, to 1, make the searching phase more smooth and spatialized, and 2, to make the reset system less complicated. Instead of forcing the player to reset the music each time they leave the area, I could create a trigger that mutes and resets everything that's already found and composable rather than all sound in the entire music system. Therefore, the sounds in the fetch quest would not be affected. This would allow not only spatialization to work and the seek distance to run more smoothly, but it would also make the coding into Unity much less complex. One other issue I would change is some of the sounds themselves. While most of the sounds worked no matter what arrangements, occasionally certain high-intensity sounds could clash. It is very hard to create so many melodies that work together polyrhythmically as well as alone. Realistically, in gameplay, this would be rare to come across, as the player has so much variation in what they decide to turn on and off, but it did mean I had the occasional problem that would take away from the engagement in the creative process. As a result, in future I would go back to the sounds that clash and change one or both of them to resolve this. I could also make some of the existing sounds simpler. Overall, I believe I have successfully created an adaptive music system in a game space that is intuitive and engaging for a wide audience of players without needing musical training. The game allows for a wide amount of variation in creative process, with an effective progression and reward system to keep interest. I also believe it is a good project to keep developing, gaining more sounds, variations and possibilities for the player.